Easter Island is the most remote island in the world, 3,500 kilometers. Now the island can be reached by plane from Santiago in 5 hours. Surprisingly, the island even has its own authentic script, Rongo Rongo. The concept of mana, the inner spiritual energy, came into our popular culture from here. Locals call this island Rapa Nui. It is known for its platform with statues called Tangerit. According to locals, these are statues of the dead leaders of the island. But few people know that there are about 890 such statues on the island. All the statues are made of volcanic tuff directly on the island, from the rocks of the extinct volcano, which is located in the northeastern part of Rapa Nui. Some statues stand alone, many of them are lying with their faces down on the ground. The platforms on which the statues are mounted have many signs that this was impossible to do with simple stone tools. They are made of solid rock and there is evidence of polygonal masonry. In the quarry where the caps for the statues were made, there were found ancient traces made by mechanical means. Very flat slices on the rocks. It seems like rocks were cut with machine tools, and also traces of fingerprints, as if rocks were melted and then sculpted like plasticine. It turns out that there was a massive production of statues, but what all the statues were for? Despite different clickbait headlines on the internet, like "The mystery of the Eastern Island statues was solved," etc., I assure you that at the moment there is not a single good answer to the question who, how and for what purpose had built all the statues on the island. The researchers conducted an experiment that shows how islanders could theoretically move statues, but this version doesn't explain how they moved them down the steep slopes, up the mountains, and how did they lift them on the platforms 3 meters height. The official age of the statues dates from the 30th to 40th centuries. At first, everyone thought the statues consisted only of heads, until one of them was excavated in 2012 and people realized that the head was only 3/8 of the entire statue. The average statue is 10 meter height and weighs 50 tons. And in the quarry lies the largest unfinished statue, which should have weighed 265 tons and be 21 meters high. All the statues face the island, and only one group of statues look towards the ocean. Locals say these are defenders of the island. There is also one unique statue, unlike the others. It seems that this is a praying man on his knees. It's made of a different material. Some bold researchers have argued that statues of Rapa Nui and wooden statues in Hawaii were made by members of the same religion and had the same function. And now let's move on to the incredible and at the same time tragic history of the island of Rapa Nui. Many people who have been to the island claim to feel the oppressive, to say unpleasant energy of the island. After digging into the history of the island, one can guess why this is so. According to the official version, the first inhabitants arrived on the island around the 12th century from the neighboring island of Gambir, which is 2,600 kilometers west of Rapa Nui. The arrived inhabitants settled on the island and divided into 9 clans, which were ruled by a chief of 9 clans. Natives said it was at this moment that the Moai statues were built, and they served as a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They were the temporary repository for the souls of the deceased chiefs, which will then return to the gods who sent them to earth. The chiefs were also reminding that they were still here, together with the living, watching and guarding the island. Despite the remoteness of the island, there were many fertile lands, and there were also enough food in the ocean. Over time, the island's population increased to 15,000. The islanders began cutting down palm trees more and more for planting sweet potatoes and other crops. This has led to soil erosion, growth of weeds in place of palm trees, and all this reduced yields. The spread of Polynesian rats on the island also played a significant role. By the 17th century, all the forests on the island had disappeared. The locals could no longer make boats to fish, and the rats destroyed the crops. When the first Europeans came to the island, there were fewer than 3,000 natives. Due to the crisis, the social structure and mythology of the locals changed. Statues were no longer considered guides between the living and the dead, Instead, there were elected people, birdmen, representatives of the ruling warriors class who at that time seized power on the island. According to the main version, it was during this period that the locals threw many statues face down in disrespect to the old idols who didn't save the island from hunger. Such a decommunization. But it's just a theory, and I want to ask you to remember it. We're going to try to dispute it later. Did you know why the island is called the Easter Island? I will tell you. The first European man who set foot on the island in 1722 was the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen. And it happened on Easter Sunday, that's why he called it Easter Island. And this Easter arrival of the Danish troops was celebrated, as was to be expected, by killing and mocking of many locals. Many people were injured. After that, they left the island, and for 50 years no one came here, but rumors about it began to spread. From the 1770s, the Spanish, the British, represented by the notorious James Cook, and the French began to arrive here, gathering more information about the island. The worst person among colonizers was the Frenchman Jean-Baptiste de Troubernier, a military officer and a slave trader who became the devil for the local population. After the arrival on the island with his armed band in 1860, he captured the chief's wife and married her, began buying up all the land on the island, killing and taking the natives to slave labor in Haiti, later turned the island into a large sheep farm. Thanks to the combined efforts of visiting sailors and diseases they brought, in 1877 there were 111 members of the local population left on the island, most of whom were old people. Almost no one left alive to read Rongo Rongo. Now let's remember the version that the natives toppled the statues and abandoned the legacy because of hunger. Let's think about it. If we take this version as a working option, the interesting facts stand out. It turns out that new generations were able to throw down a few dozens of statues, but they couldn't hide them somewhere, throw them into the ocean or destroy them. I mean, they threw down old idols, but they are lying here and there and reminding new generations of their power. The ancestors were able to create a huge amount of statues and place them where they wanted, but new generations didn't manage even to bring down all the statues. Then I have another risky theory that I think is more plausible. The statues could have been toppled by any of the European colonizers, but of course the history of the island was written by the representatives of the colonizers. I don't think they wanted such events to be written into history. We came to the island, killed and abused their population, some people were enslaved and took to Haiti, and after seeing the huge statues, our soldiers decided to show their strength and to knock down a couple dozen statues, which were bothering them with their appearance. I don't insist on anything, but I personally think this version is more plausible. By the way, the official history of the island is known to us thanks to a secular monk, which already sounds interesting, a Christian missionary, Jean Heroux, a Frenchman who arrived on the island in 1866 under the protection of Jean-Baptiste. While Jean-Baptiste was committing atrocities on the island and pretending to be God, Jean was burning all the Rongo Rongo wooden tablets he could find. He gave the most important Moai statue to the Americans, and before died from the tuberculosis, which was popular on the island that time, he turned all the remaining on the island Rapa Nuians to Christianity. In 1866, Heroux wrote, "The chances of triumph show themselves day by day to be ever more certain, and the hour of providence seems to have arrived for the inhabitants of Easter Island." The mission was established the moment the work of destruction touched its final limits. He didn't specify the causes of this destruction. Unfortunately, given 100 years of extermination of the local population and its culture, I consider quite naive idea to rely on the information of current natives regarding the statues and ancient history of the island. After the death of Jean-Baptiste, the island was inherited by a man who devoted his life to the restoration of the island, its heritage and its return to the local population, Alexander Salmon Jr. He returned all of the expatriates, personally studied Rongo Rongo, trained the local population in trade, and began to develop tourism and protect the island's cultural artifacts. After 10 years of rule, he sold the island to the Chilean authorities. In 1966, the island was officially colonized by Chile, and the locals became Chilean citizens, although many of them are not happy about it. There is still a struggle for equal rights between Rapa Nui and the Chilean, in which Rapa Nui are still losing. In 1996, the statues were officially inscribed on the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List, and in 2017 was officially handed over to the people of Rapa Nui. Finally, I want to share the fascinating story of an annual ritual contest of collecting the first sooty tern egg of the season from the islet of Motunui. The ritual of birdman existed in the late Rapa Nui culture. Spirits showed shamans in dreams the chosen important inhabitants of the island. The chosen ones assigned themselves a hopu, the strongest man of their tribe who had a lower status. Hopu of each contestant had to sail a mile to the rocks of Motunui with food and waited for the arrival of terns, spending days and weeks there hunting for the first egg. During this race, many hopu had drowned, some were eaten by sharks or fell off a cliff. But often it was allowed to choose a spare hopu instead. The participant himself sat and waited in a stone village. Hopu, who was first to find the egg, had to climb to the highest point of Motunui and shouted to his patron that he has got the egg and have to shave his head. Listeners on the beach of the island passed this message to the contestant. The losers then sailed back to the island, and the hunter with the egg stayed on the island and starved for a while. He soon returns to the island with an egg tied to his forehead. Returning to Rapa Nui, he climbed a steep rocky slope and, if he didn't fall, presented an egg to his patron, who had already shaved his head and painted it in white or red. The winner of the contest will be declared a Tangata Manu, a birdman, and the chief of the island for 1 year. New Tangata Manu received gifts in form of food and other offerings and was alone in a special sacred house for a year. His clan had the sole right to harvest eggs and chicks on Motunui, and he himself had been eating, sleeping and doing nothing for a year. It's not clear if Hopu got anything for the work he did. We don't know for sure whether this ritual was part of a religion associated with the statues or came to replace them. But finds like this one suggest a possible unity between the birdman cult and the Moai statues. So that was a story of an interesting island of Rapa Nui, shrouded in secrets and survived many shocks. Leave comments if you liked this video, subscribe to the channel and see you next Tuesday.